Chapter 12. Conspiracy among the Jesuits. Their expulsion from Spain and its dependencies. They are received with artillery at CIVITA VECCHIA. Their landing in Corsica. Letter from Clement XIII to Charles III. General reflections. The reign of Charles III, a memorable one for many reasons, was above all such by the expulsion of the Jesuits and the truly despotic manner in which it was effected. History offers few examples of a political persecution like that suffered by the Company in Spain. Founded by a Spaniard and composed chiefly of Spaniards during the earlier period of its existence, it was, under that Austrian dynasty from which Spain suffered so much, attached to the kings for purposes of mutual preservation. The Jesuits formed the vanguard of the armies of fanaticism and the propagators of the Inquisition of the Philips. Spain and its dependencies were the chosen land of the Jesuits, which contained 5,014 out of their entire number of 22,787 at the moment the company was suppressed, while 6 also of their 39 provinces were Spanish and included 259 out of their 1,365 houses. We have seen in the former chapter what a fabulous amount their property in France reached at the time of their suppression, but they are said to have had much more in Spain. The king then watched their proceedings closely and came at last to the conclusion that their interests and his own were incompatible. He also ascertained that the Jesuits, annoyed by the tendency of his government, were conspiring to place on the throne in his stead his brother Don Luis, on whose sympathy they had counted, and that in order to have a pretext for the atrocity, they spread a rumor that Charles was the bastard son of Alberoni and Elizabeth Farnese. The revolt was to have broken out on Holy Thursday at the moment of the king's visiting the churches, and the first act would have been the seizure of his person. So great was the dread this powerful monarch came to conceive of the Company of Jesus, that he did not venture to proceed by any ordinary means against it, but with the greatest secrecy, and more like a conspirator than a legitimate monarch, he prepared during a year and a half, in conjunction with his minister and confidant Aranda, a measure for their expulsion from his dominions. It may be calculated how Europe was astonished at this resolution of Charles III, a monarch in no way resembling Louis XV of France or Joseph of Bragança, the King of Portugal, who were of weak character, and allowed themselves to be governed by their mistresses and favorites. For Charles was active and virtuous, and not much led by his ministers, but in the habit of examining public affairs for himself, and of wielding his authority with much resolution and with very upright views. No secret was ever better guarded than that design against the Jesuits which the king shared during 18 months with Aranda, Manuel de Roda, Flora de Blanca, and Campomenes. Such documents as they did not write themselves, they entrusted to the hands of very young children who could not comprehend what they were doing. The first notice that Pope Clement XIII received of the expulsion of the Jesuits was brought him by a state courier and consisted in an autograph letter from the king with a copy of the enactment. It was hereby forbidden to the Jesuits to return to Spain under any pretext, and to the ecclesiastical authorities to make in the pulpit the slightest allusion to their expulsion, while any censure of or petition against the law was to be regarded as an act of high treason. The orders of the government were executed on one day and at 1 hour throughout the Spanish dominions. On the 2nd of April, 1767, the provincial authorities and the governors of the towns were to open the tied-up and sealed warrants which they had received beforehand, and to execute the orders contained in them under pain of death. The warrants were fastened with 3 seals, and had these words inscribed upon the cover, quote, "Under pain of death, you are not to open this packet until the afternoon of the 2nd of April, 1767, unquote. and the order contained in the warrant said, quote, I invest you with all my authority and royal power, that you may forthwith present yourself with an armed force in the house of the Company of Jesus, and within 24 hours conduct them as prisoners to the port designated, where they will be embarked in the vessels there prepared for them. At the very moment of your executing this, you will place seals upon the archives of the house and the papers of the individual members, without allowing anyone to carry away anything beyond his books of devotion and the necessary clothes for his voyage. If a single Jesuit be left behind, even though he be sick or dying, you will be punished with death." Unquote. On the same day was published the royal rescript referring to the Jesuits, which in substance stated that the king, impelled by considerations of the greatest moment, as his obligation to maintain order, peace, and justice among the people he ruled, and others no less righteous and necessary, had thought fit to expel from his dominions all members of the Company of Jesus, and to confiscate their goods. This measure was executed with the greatest punctuality in the colonies, as well as in the mother country. On the 14th of April, 1767, the Spanish minister Rodas wrote to his agent Don Nicolas de Azara, quote, "At last the operation was concluded in all the houses of the Jesuits, and according to the notices that reach us, they are now on their way to the different ports of embarkation. Thither we are sending these precious wares for you. Fools, women, and dunces are passionately fond of these people, and do not cease to importune us for them, which comes of their blindness." The Jesuits had made themselves masters of the tribunals, the monasteries, the convents, and the houses of the grandees and of the ministers, so that they oppressed everyone, ruled consciences, and ruled Spain. Unquote. On the 28th of April, he wrote in another letter directed to Azara, quote, "All that could now be said at Rome to prevent the departure of the Jesuits would come too late, and it is most probable that, if the court of Rome triumphed, some scandal would ensue, because there are not wanting materials to discredit and confound them throughout Europe." Unquote. Quote, "It is because they are not my subjects," unquote, said the king, quote, "but those of the Pope and their general, that I send them to these," unquote. But unfortunately, the Pope and the general, more cruel than the King of Spain himself, refused to harbor their most faithful servants and resolute champions, and the vessels in which the Jesuits arrived, seeking shelter as at the house of their father, were received at CIVITA VECCHIA with volleys of artillery. The apologists for the Roman authorities in this transaction have alleged the difficulty of maintaining so many people, as if this consideration, supposing even it was well founded, could excuse brethren for refusing an asylum to their proscribed brethren. But in fact it was quite groundless, because the King of Spain had promised to pay the Pope $100 for each Jesuit so long as they remained in the Pontifical States. Thus the exiles were deprived by this inhospitality of another succor. A century ago, the value of $100 was nearly that of 200 now, and with such a sum the Jesuits could have got on comfortably, as having no families to maintain, and living with that economy to which the life of the monastery had accustomed them. Their expulsion from Spain was unexpected and strange, and was effected with a barbarous severity, but still more barbarous was the refusal of the Pope to welcome them in his dominions, for when he treated them as strangers or deserters, to whom else was it possible they should have recourse? Did not his rejection of them even justify the resolution adopted by the King of Spain for their expulsion? How can they have been good enough to remain in Spain if they were not good enough to be received in Rome? But if it had been only for the sake of Christian charity, the states of the Church ought to have furnished an asylum for some 6,000 banished Catholic priests of various ages and conditions, including many learned personages and men of noble lineages, some of them bowed down with years and infirmities, who arrived destitute of the most necessary articles, and had been pent up during a long voyage in narrow and ill-constructed cabins. The French, and indeed the Portuguese Jesuits, had been received in Rome with much coldness, but in the end they had been allowed to land. But the Spaniards, as we have said, were greeted with cannonballs, and they retired incensed against their general, who, in their distress, had treated them like enemies. They reproached him with his inhumanity, and accused him as the cause of all their misfortunes. The captains of the Spanish vessels might have braved the papal cannons and landed the Jesuits by main force, but they refrained and sailed towards Genoa and Leghorn, where, however, they were received in the same manner. At all points the people refused to admit these vessels, from the moment they learned that there were Jesuits on board of them. It was only after much going backwards and forwards, and having been at sea between 5 and 6 months, that the exiles were allowed to set their feet on shores in Corsica. Nor had they long rested there before they were again expelled by the French, to whom the Republic of Genoa had sold the island. They were then shipped off to Genoa, and thence conducted to Bologna, and subsequently to Ferrara. The Spanish government allowed each Jesuit an annual pension of $100. All their property was confiscated, and not a single voice was raised, either within the church or outside it, to protest against their banishment or their spoliation. The following expression is found among the instructions sent to the Spanish ambassador in Rome. Quote, "Your Excellency will give no explanation, but be content with delivering the royal message." Unquote. Clement XIII wrote to Charles III, saying, quote, "Of all the wounds we have endured during the 9 unhappy years of our pontificate, no one has been more deeply felt by our paternal heart than that which your Majesty announces to us. Is it the fact, sire, that any member of the order has troubled your kingdom? In this case, why do you not, sire, punish the guilty without including the innocent in their sentence? We affirm before God and men that the majority of the members in the spirit of the Company of Jesus are unblameable, nor is it merely a harmless society, but one that is pious, useful, and holy in its laws and maxims." Unquote. The Pope forgot, when he thus urged that Charles III should have punished only the guilty among the Jesuits, if there were any, that, according to their privileges, they could only have been punished by the superiors of their own order. Charles III wrote back to Clement, quote, "In order to save the world a great scandal, I will always keep secret within my heart the abominable plot which has made necessary these severities. Your Holiness must believe me on my word of honor. The safety of my life requires that I should preserve a profound silence on these points." Unquote. The king feared the Jesuits even after he had expelled them. Ferdinand VII, when he returned to Spain, thanks to the triumph of the Revolution of 1808, overthrew liberty, restored the Inquisition, and in 1815 made an attempt to restore the Jesuits. They, in fact, re-entered the country, whether legally or illegally, and extended themselves under various denominations. They have suffered several vicissitudes since that epoch, but it may be averred that they have prospered more and advanced more rapidly than Charles III and his ministers could have expected when they banished them forever, though their institutions have remained unmodified and are more opposed to those of the country than they were in any former period. Expelled in 1820, they returned in 1823, but in 1835 the people rose and sacked their monasteries in Madrid and other places, killing many of them, after which their order was suppressed and their property confiscated. The reaction of 1844 allowed them to return, but the Revolution of 1854 again expelled them. In 1856, another reaction reopened Spain to them, and in 1868 they were again expelled, with their constant protectors, the Bourbons, their effects being confiscated as before. Chapter 13. Expulsion of the Jesuits from Naples and Parma, excommunication of Ferdinand of Bourbon by Clement XIII, letters of ALEMBERT and the King of Prussia, Abolition of the company by Clement XIV. Confiscation of their goods. The Pope dies by poison. Brief written by him on the Jesuits. There were 53 Jesuits' houses and 3,622 Jesuits in Naples and Sicily at the time their companions were expelled from Spain, and King Ferdinand of Naples hastened to imitate the example of Charles III. He pounced upon the company on the night of the 3rd of November, 1767, laid an embargo on the houses and all that was in them, and got the inmates conducted to the shore under a good escort so hastily that, by the next morning, they were already out at sea on the road to Terracina. The Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, who was governor of that island, dealt in a similar fashion with the Jesuits there residing on 22nd of April, 1768. We have seen the Jesuits expelled from nearly all the Catholic countries, that is, from Portugal, France, Spain, and Naples. The turn came last to the Duchy of Parma, which was governed by the Infante Ferdinand of Bourbon, against whom the Pope, alleging that the duchies of Parma, Pacienza, and Guastalla belonged to himself as their legitimate sovereign, launched a sentence of excommunication such as there had not been since the time of Innocent III. This supposed right of the Pope arose from the donation of the celebrated Countess Matilda of Tuscany, which, however, had never been considered as legitimate by the emperors, who regarded her merely as a vassal of Henry III, and as not entitled to confer provinces upon the Pope without the consent of her suzerain. On this principle, Pacienza, after the murder of the bastard who had been set over it by Paul III, was seized by the Emperor Charles V, who retained it until his death. The imperial claims to the province were afterwards solemnly recognized in the treaties of Cambrai and Soissons. In this way, things went on until the reigning prince, Ferdinand, thought it dangerous to allow the Jesuits to remain in his dominions, and was encouraged by proceedings in the great neighboring nations to expel them and confiscate their goods. It was then that the Pope, in his famous brief of the 30th of January, 1768, declared the duchies his own, saying that whatever was done in the name of the Duke of Parma was illegitimate. He excommunicated all who had directly or indirectly taken part with the Duke, and enacted that no one should presume to absolve him from his sins. A convocation of cardinals at Rome declared similarly that the Duke's administration was sacrilegious. The last papal excommunication of this kind had been launched in 1630, and was also aimed at a Duke of Parma, namely Edward Farnese, the maternal ancestor of him now in question. Clement XIII no doubt supposed, when he took the step, that the nations styled Catholic were as credulous in the 18th century as they had been in the Middle Ages, that the Duke's subjects would hasten to rise against him, and that they would be supported by all Christendom in arms. But alas, the times were considerably altered, for the papal excommunication produced not the slightest effect either on the persons denounced or on others, so that the Duke and his descendants continued to reign in spite of the Pope and cardinals who had deposed and anathematized them. The Parliament of Paris considered the brief of excommunication as aimed at itself, and the cabinet of the King of France answered the bull that dethroned the Duke of Parma by taking possession of Avignon and the country of Venaissin, which had now for many centuries belonged to the Apostolic See by a grant from the kings of France, but which thenceforth became definitely united to that country. The Neapolitan government, on its part, took possession of the cities of Benevento and Pontevedra, asserting that they were appurtenances of the crown of Naples. The slight or nugatory effect produced during many centuries by papal excommunications has no doubt contributed to make their publication less frequent than it formerly was. Nevertheless, the bull of Julius II, In Sine Domini, is still published in Rome every Holy Thursday, as it has been without intermission since the time of Paul III. A cardinal deacon reads it, at the gate of St. Peter's in the presence of the Pope, who then throws a lighted torch into the middle of the square to warn Christian nations how God will burn with hellfire the soul of everyone who violates this bull's enactments. In the 14th article hereof, the sentence of the greatest excommunication is pronounced against all chancellors and councillors, ordinary and extraordinary, of any kings or princes whatever, against all presidents of chambers, councils, and parliaments, and all attorneys general, arrogating to themselves ecclesiastical causes, or hindering the execution of apostolic bulls, even under the pretext of preventing outrages. The same article reserves to the Pope exclusively the power of absolving the said chancellors, councillors, and other excommunicated persons, who cannot be absolved without first publicly revoking their decrees and resolutions, and expunging them from their books and registers. It is long since any so-called Christian people have been without legislators, ministers, or magistrates to whom this bull has not been applicable, or who have not been thereby excommunicated. The bull excommunicating the Duke of Parma was suppressed by all the European governments. The Company of Jesus had not yet, however, received its death blow, but when a pope had recently excommunicated the persecutors of the Jesuits, his successor, Clement XIV, had no sooner mounted the papal chair than he virtually vindicated them by suppressing the company as detrimental to that religion for whose propagation and defense it had been instituted. Nevertheless, O anomaly of anomalies, the heretical and schismatical Frederick II refused to countenance this persecution and authorized the Jesuits to remain in his dominions. On this subject his friend d'Alembert wrote to him on the 16th of June, 1769, quote, "It is said that the Franciscan Ganganelli, Clement XIV, promises something hard to digest to the Company of Jesus, and that St. Francis of Assisi can afford very well to make an end of St. Ignatius. However, it appears to me that any pope, whether a Franciscan or otherwise, would commit an egregious absurdity if he were to cashier his regiment of bodyguards in order to give satisfaction to Christian princes. I think this would be like the agreement made between the wolves and the sheep. When the latter give up their dogs, you know what followed. Whatever may be the result, it will be very singular, sire, if while their most Christian, Catholic, Apostolic, and most faithful majesties are destroying the Pope's grenadiers, your heretical majesty should remain their sole protector." Unquote. On the same subject, d'Alembert wrote again to Frederick on the 7th of August of the same year, quote, "It is averred that the Franciscan Pope wants to have his sleeve many times pulled before he will abolish the Company of Jesus, and I do not wonder at this. To propose to a pope the destruction of his brave militia is much the same as if one proposed to your majesty to dismiss the grenadiers of your guard." Unquote. Historians have differently appreciated, according to their own sentiments, the conduct of Clement XIV towards the Jesuits. According to the partisans of the company, the Pope resolved upon its suppression under the influence of solicitations and threats from the governments which had expelled the Jesuits from their own dominions, and particularly of Charles III of Spain, whose ambassador at Rome, Florida Blanca, is said to have left Clement XIV no rest by day or night. Others suppose that the Pope allowed himself to be importuned only in conformity with a prudent policy in respect to his own person, and that he might strike the blow more safely. In our opinion, both these views are well-founded, but only in part, for we do not believe that this Pope, who displayed a more independent character than his predecessors, would have suppressed the company if he had not liked to, nor yet do we doubt that he was much pressed to adopt this measure by the interested governments. Up to this time no one had sued the Jesuits in Rome without losing his cause, nor had private persons been allowed even to bring actions against them without a dispensation from the supreme authority, their privileges guaranteed impunity to them. But the Pope withdrew at length this protecting hand from them, and the defective administration of their seminaries, together with the extent of their indebtedness, soon ceased to be screened from observation. 3 visitors who were appointed to examine their famous college in Rome found it in such a condition that they confiscated the property of the establishment to pay its creditors. They carried the costly furniture to the Mont de Piete and sold the wines and provisions by public auction. They furthermore took possession of the houses of the company in Frascati and Tivoli, and the rigor with which they treated them was still greater in the legations. Cardinal Melveri, Archbishop of Bologna, visited the institutes of the society in his diocese, sent the pupils in the colleges and the novices back to their parents, locked up the schools, and put many of the Jesuits under arrest. It was in this manner that the Pope prepared himself for the publication of the decree suppressing the company throughout Christendom. After he had signed the brief, he surveyed his work and said with a sigh, quote, "Yes, here is the desired suppression. I do not repent of what I have done. I did not resolve upon it without mature consideration. I would sign it again if it were necessary. But in this suppression, I have been signing my own death sentence." Unquote. On the 21st of July, 1773, he published the brief Dominus ac Redemptor. Immediately afterwards, the prelates Macedonio and Alfani betook themselves to the professed House of Jesus. Other prelates set off, at the same time, for the numerous dependent establishments of the company. The Jesuits assembled on all sides to read the brief. Seals were placed on all the houses of the order, and troops were left to guard them. On the following day the schools were closed, the Jesuits had relinquished their functions, and the church services were performed by the Capuchin friars. On the same day, the general of the professed house was conducted to the College of the English. He was watched without intermission, stripped of the insignia of his dignity, and compelled to officiate in the habit of a simple clerk, but allowed the services of a lay brother. His arrest and the dissolution of the company produced a great impression on the mind of General Rizzi. An indictment having been drawn up against him, he denied having concealed any money, but confessed the secret relations he had entertained with the King of Prussia. He was thereupon shut up in the castle of St. Angelo, and there treated very unceremoniously and with the same severity as the other prisoners. The Pope forgot his prognostications that the suppression of the Jesuits would cost him his life. He appeared satisfied with his work. The Roman people gave him enthusiastic acclamations, the government of France restored Avignon to him, and the Neapolitan government Benevento, which circumstance affixed a new seal to his popularity. Clement XIV had always enjoyed good health, and his temperament was a very robust one. Yet rumors began presently to circulate of his impending death, though there was nothing in his appearance to warrant the anticipation. The Pythoness of Valentino predicted this event with notable pertinacity, and the impression that it was coming seemed to have spread and received some confirmation in the Holy Week of 1774. Clement shut himself up in his palace and refused to see anyone. The diplomatic corps was not received by him until the 17th of August. Great was the surprise of the ambassadors when they saw him reduced to the appearance of a skeleton. The Pope guessed their impression and hastened to assure them that his health had never been better, but from that day forward it was announced to the leading European governments that a new conclave must inevitably be soon assembled. How did the Pope pass in so short a time from a state of excellent health to one of infirmity and decrepitude? In rising one day from table, Ganganelli had felt himself attacked with intestine pains and a great chilliness. He was discomposed, but tranquilized himself by imputing it to indigestion. Nevertheless, his most intimate friends were forced to discern about him very alarming symptoms. An inflammation spread from his vital parts up to his throat, and compelled him to keep his mouth incessantly open. He frequently vomited, and the weakness of his limbs obliged him to give up the long walks to which he had been accustomed. His sleep was broken with acute pains until he could scarcely get the least repose. His vigor, which had been almost youthful, was succeeded by an absolute prostration and by signs of the most imminent decay, so that the unfortunate man could not but discern that he was the victim of a crime. Meantime his character degenerated, and from being frank, kindly, and good-tempered, he grew suspicious and irritable. He saw all around him nothing but daggers and poisoned cups. He began to cook his own food. He locked himself up in his rooms, refused to see anyone, and ended by losing his reason. He died after 6 months of torment on the 22nd of September, 1774. The impression that he had died by poison was confirmed after his death. His swollen body burst and became rapidly decomposed. His skin had adhered to his clothes, and his hair to his pillow. His nails fell off when they were touched. All Rome cried out that he had drunk the, quote, aqua tofana, unquote, of Perugia. Cardinal Bermia, the French ambassador in Rome, wrote on the 28th of September in the following terms respecting the previous occurrences, quote, "The nature of the Pope's illness and other important circumstances make it commonly believed his death was not a natural one. The physicians who were present at the opening of the body speak with much more reserve than the surgeons, but the truth is so shocking that there seems to be no desire to have it clearly ascertained," unquote. On the 26th of October, the same cardinal wrote, quote, "When those things are known which I know by the documents the late Pope gave me access to, it will be obvious that the suppression of the Jesuits was just and necessary. The circumstances that preceded, accompanied, and followed the death of the late Pope excite horror as well as compassion. We must not conceal from the king the truths, however distressing, which will be confirmed by history," unquote. We have mentioned that Pope Clement XIV observed in signing the decree for the suppression of the Jesuits that he was signing his own death warrant. We now give some extracts from the sentence pronounced against the Jesuits, which he expected to prove so fatal to its author. Brief of Pope Clement XIV. Quote, "Among the things that contribute to promote the welfare of Christendom, there is no doubt that one of the foremost positions deserves to be occupied by the religious orders as supports and ornaments of the Church, which has actually derived from them the greatest benefits. But when things have come to such a pitch that from some of these orders the people of Christ no longer derive those abundant fruits and much desired advantages which were expected from their institution, and when they have even degenerated, and are observed to have become pernicious and liable to disturb the tranquillity of nations rather than promote it, the Apostolic See has not hesitated either to give them new regulations and restore their pristine discipline, or completely to dissolve and destroy them. On this ground, Pope Innocent III, when he perceived that the number of the religious orders occasioned many commotions in the Church of God, expressly prohibited the establishment of new religious orders at the Fourth General Council of the Lateran. Although these regulations were issued with so much wisdom by our predecessor Innocent III, yet not only has the approbation of new religious orders been since extorted by importune demands from the Apostolic See, but over and above this, the presumptuous temerity of some men has resulted in an almost indefinite multiplication of orders, above all of mendicants. In recognition of this abuse, Pope Gregory X renewed in the General Council of Lyons the Constitution of Innocent III, and prohibited still more rigorously the invention of new religious orders, abolishing forever, among those established since the Fourth General Council of the Lateran, all such as had not the approbation of the Holy See, and enjoining that the orders thus approved should continue to exist only on condition of not admitting any fresh novices or founding any new monasteries, and of not alienating those they already possessed, without the Pope's express permission. Our predecessor Clement V, on the 2nd of May 1312, suppressed and utterly abolished the military order of the Templars on account of its general bad reputation, notwithstanding that, in previous times, it had rendered Christendom such important services that the Holy See loaded it with benefits, privileges, donations, exemptions, and important functions, and although the General Council of Vienna, to which the examination of this subject was submitted, was of opinion that no definitive sentence ought to have been pronounced, Pope Pius V suppressed entirely the order of the Humiliated Brethren, whose establishment, however, was anterior to the Council of the Lateran. Pope Urban VIII suppressed forever, on the 6th of February 1625, the Congregation of the Reformed Conventual Brethren, although approved by Sixtus V, and on the 2nd of December 1643, he suppressed also the religious order of St. Ambrose and St. Barnabas. Innocent X suppressed on the 29th of October 1650 the order of St. Basilis de Amaris on account of its turbulent behavior, and similarly on the 22nd of June 1651 the Congregation of the Clergy of the Good Jesus. Clement IX likewise suppressed 3 religious orders, namely the so-called Canons of St. George and Halga, the Hieronymists of Jesuits, and the Jesuits established by St. John Columbanus. Having considered all these examples, in desiring to advance with a confident step in the resolution of which we shall proceed to speak, we have spared no pains or research to understand thoroughly all that concerns the origin, progress, and actual condition of the Company of Jesus, and we have ascertained that it was established by its holy founder for the salvation of souls, the conversion of heretics, and still more of infidels, and for the further increase of religion and piety, and that, in order to attain more easily and prosperously to the desired end, he instituted therein a very strict vow of religious poverty for the community as well as the individual members. But while yet in its cradle, this society was seen to breed various germs of discord and jealousy, which not only divided its members among themselves, but induced them to rise against the other religious orders, against the secular clergy, against academies, colleges, universities, public schools, and the very sovereigns who have admitted them into their dominions, and all these disorders and dissensions reached this pitch from the nature and character of their vows, from their mode of admitting novices to utter them, and from the prerogative exercised in sending them on missions, and in admitting them to holy orders without a title, and without having made the corresponding vows, a thing contrary to the decisions of the Council of Trent and of Pius V. At other times, disorders arose from the absolute power claimed by the general, and from some other articles in the rule of the company. Others have arisen from the colleges, from the privileges which the ordinaries and other ecclesiastical and civic dignitaries found adverse to their rights and jurisdictions. But altogether no accusation has been found too severe to raise against this society, which has already long disturbed the tranquillity and peace of Christendom. Hence have arisen complaints from all sides against this religious order. No precautions have been found sufficient to still the complaints and outcries that have arisen against the society. On the contrary, they have been re-echoed through the world, and many have accused the institution of being entirely adverse to orthodox faith and to good morals. The society has been lacerated by its internal and external controversies, and one of the most surprising charges brought against it is that of peculiar avidity in the acquisition of worldly goods. Such was the origin of these disorders, which are, alas, too well known, and which have caused much pain and grief to the Apostolic See. Such is the cause of the resolutions which many sovereigns have adopted against the order. The result has been that these religious men, when they wanted to obtain from Paul V a new confirmation of their privileges, were obliged to beg that he would ratify and sanction certain decrees published in the Fifth General Congregation of the Company and inserted in the bull of the 4th of September 1606. In these decrees we are told of the society in connection with revolts and enmities among its members and complaints and accusations leveled against it by outsiders as follows, quote, "Our society, which has been raised up by God himself for the propagation of the faith and the salvation of souls, may, by the spiritual weapons which are the proper attributes of our institution, successfully attain, under the standard of the cross, the object it proposes to itself conformably with the benefit of the Church and the advantage of its neighbors, but, on the other hand, it would destroy these advantages and expose itself to the greatest dangers if it were to employ itself in the business of the world, or of policy and state government. But inasmuch as, in the present unhappy times, our order, perhaps through the ambition and indiscreet zeal of some of its members, has come to be attacked in various countries and defamed before many of the sovereigns, of whom our Father Ignatius, of happy memory, recommended us to cultivate the esteem and friendship, and as, moreover, the good Savior of Jesus Christ is necessary to produce good fruits, the congregation thinks it necessary to abstain from all appearance of evil, and, if possible, to prevent complaints, even though they would be founded on false suspicions. Wherefore the Company, by these present articles, prohibits all religious persons, under the severest penalties, from meddling even when invited in political matters." Unquote. We have observed with much grief that these remedies, and many others since employed, have not been efficacious, nor was there strength enough in them to destroy and dissipate the aforesaid disorders, and the complaints and accusations that have been leveled against the society, and that our predecessors, Urban the VIII, Clement the IX, 10th, 11th, and 12th, Alexander the 7th and 8th, Innocent the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th, and Benedict the 14th, have striven in vain to restore to the Church the desired tranquility in questions relative to those secular concerns with which the Company ought not to have occupied itself, and in regard to the serious altercations that have arisen among its members, with loss of souls and great offense among Christian people, as about the interpretation and practice of certain pagan ceremonies which have been tolerated and admitted in various places, while those approved by the universal Church have been neglected, and on the use and interpretation of the maxims justly prohibited by the Holy See as scandalous and contrary to good morals, and lastly, on other subjects of great importance and absolutely necessary to preserve the purity and integrity of the faith. Altercations which in past centuries and in the present have given rise to considerable evils, abuses, disorders, and seditions in many Catholic states, and persecutions of the Church in some territories in Asia and even in Europe, which have grievously affected many of our ancestors. Among these, Pope Innocent XI found it necessary to prohibit the Company from giving the habit to novices, Innocent III to threaten it with the same penalty, and Benedict XIV to order a visitation of the houses and colleges of Portugal and the Algarves. But the Holy See has obtained no consolation, the Society no relief, and Christianity no advantage from the last apostolic letters of Clement XIII, which were procured from him by violence, and in which he highly approves of and again authorizes the institution of the Company of Jesus. After so many hurricanes, commotions, and horrible tempests, true believers were hoping at length to see a day dawn of calm and profound peace. But the clamors and accusations against the Company have increased, producing dissensions, perilous seditions, and even scandals, which have destroyed the bonds of Christian charity, and kindled in the hearts of believers a spirit of party, together with enmities and animosities. So far has the danger gone, that the very benefactors of the society, who are advantageously known by all nations, namely, our very dear children in Christ, the kings of France, Spain, Portugal, and the two Sicilies, have been obliged to expel all the religious men of the company from their dominions, under the conviction that this extreme measure was the sole remedy for many evils. These same kings, our very dear brethren in Jesus Christ, believed that this remedy might not be durable without the abolition of the company, and besought Clement XIII to suppress it. But the unexpected death of that sovereign pontiff retarded the completion of the proceedings, and from the moment when we, by the mercy of God, took possession of the chair of St. Peter, these same requests and solicitations have been repeatedly addressed to us, and confirmed by those of many bishops and other personages illustrious by their station, piety, and learning. Nevertheless, as we desire to adopt the safer course in so difficult a subject, we have thought it necessary not only to devote much time to the most careful and serious researches and inquiries, but also to seek from the Father of all lights his especial succor and assistance by our groans and continual prayers, after studying that we might be supported before God by those of other believers, as well as by their good works. Having used all these most necessary resources, and being aided, as we believe, by the presence and inspiration of the Holy Ghost, and constrained, moreover, by the duty of promoting, maintaining, and securing with all our ability the repose and tranquility of the Christian people, and rooting up whatever might cause it the slightest hurt, and having ascertained, moreover, that the company of Jesus could not produce the abundant fruits and important advantages for which it was instituted, and that it was almost impossible the Church should enjoy any true and solid peace while this order should exist, urged by such solid reasons, and stimulated, moreover, by the motives suggested by prudence and by the requirements of the Church in regard to administration, treading in the footsteps of our predecessors, and especially of Gregory X, as the question is of a mendicant order, after mature examination, and in the certainty of our knowledge, and the fullness of our apostolic power, we suppress and abolish the Society of Jesus. We destroy and abrogate all and each of its offices, functions, and administrations, its houses, schools, colleges, asylums, hospices, and all other places appertaining to it, of whatever kind, and in whatever country, realm, or province situated, together with all its statutes, customs, usages, constitutions, unquote, etc., etc. Clement XIV was unable to destroy the Company of Jesus because, being dispersed throughout the world, the Jesuits were not compelled to recognize his authority to suppress their institution. Hence, it was only under the Catholic governments that the bull was executed, while in the Asiatic missions in Prussia, Russia, and in some other Protestant or schismatic countries, neither the governments nor the Jesuits paid the king the least attention. In the Pontifical States, the company possessed, at the moment of its prohibition, 31 houses comprising 848 members. In Austria, where the emperor obeyed the papal bull and suppressed the Jesuits, there were 74 houses and 1,772 members, and the value of the confiscated property exceeded £2 million. In Poland, the Jesuits were also suppressed, having had their 71 houses and 1,050 members. Father Rizzi, the general of the company, died soon after the Pope in the castle of St. Angelo in November 1775. Chapter 14. Frederick of Prussia and Catherine of Russia protect the Jesuits. Propagation of the company in Russia. Nomination of a new general. Re-establishment of the company by Pius VII. Reflections on its present condition. Condemned and dissolved by the Pope, Expelled from all Catholic countries in Europe, the Jesuits took refuge and recovered themselves in the north under the protection of Frederick, the Protestant king of Prussia, and Catherine, the schismatic empress of Russia. These despotic sovereigns expected to find them useful in subduing and taming by moral means the barbarous and half-savage peoples whom they had recently annexed to their dominions. They despised the dangers that might have been apprehended from the Catholic ideas of the fugitives, especially because they saw them, at this moment, renounced by the Pope and the Catholic sovereigns, and they began to make of them a supplement to their scourges and bayonets. The Jesuits, on the other hand, readily accommodated themselves to this new part by the pliability and subtlety of their character, and by the ease with which they were able to change their garb, and outwardly to adapt themselves to circumstances. They gave satisfaction to these heretical sovereigns, and successfully established themselves among the semi-barbarous tribes of the north. Catherine of Russia merely sought for political allies in them, and with this view allowed them to settle in White Russia, a province which she had snatched from Poland. She found no reason to repent of her policy, for the Jesuits effectively promoted her designs upon the last-named unhappy country. In 1774, at the date of its first partition, the Jesuits possessed at Polotsk a magnificent building surrounded with lands in which they had 10,000 stags at their disposal. A portion of these estates was on the right, and another on the left bank of the Dwina. Their influence was immense, as may be supposed, since they united in their corporation the three attributes which enslave the bodies and souls of men, and make all freedom an impossibility to them. They were spiritual lords, landlords, and feudal lords. What spirit, what independence of character can resist this combination of powers in the hands of an individual? Between breaking up in obedience to the sole authority they had proclaimed, and disobeying it by submitting to a schismatic emperor in order to evade the fulfillment of Pope Clement's bull, the Jesuits of Poland preferred the latter alternative. They passed from the left bank of the Dwina, which was still Polish, to the right, which was already Russian. They vowed fidelity to the Orthodox Catherine, and retained their position, habit, and name in Russia, in spite of the papal bull, of which she forbade the publication among her subjects. In 1782, the Jesuits of Polotsk assembled in a congregation and nominated a new general. How remarkable was the situation of this order of monks, arrayed in rebellion against the Pope, and sustained against Catholic by heretical and schismatic sovereigns! How extraordinary, even in a higher degree, was this division of Catholicism against itself! It was now not Rome, but Russia, that was the head and center of the Company of Jesus. But, alack, they ended in Russia, as in the other countries, by getting into bad odor, and being again subjected to a general expulsion. Their banishment from this country did not, however, take place until they had been re-established in the rest of Europe. Pope Pius VII undid in 1814 the work performed by Clement XIV in 1773, and the sovereigns of Europe carried out their reactionary policy at this period by allying themselves with their ancient enemies, the Jesuits, reinstating them, restoring to them, as far as they were able, their former privileges and possessions, and committing to them the education of their young subjects, who were to learn the doctrine of passive obedience from them. The following is an extract from the bull published by Pius VII on the 19th of August, 1814, re-establishing the Company of Jesus. Quote, "The said fathers having been recommended to us by the Emperor Paul, then reigning, in his gracious dispatch of the 11th of August, in which he manifested to us the particular predilection he felt for them, and stated to us that it would be very agreeable to him to see the Company of Jesus established in his empire under our authority, and we considering, on our part, the great benefits that might be obtained from these vast regions, and the succor that would be afforded to the Catholic religion by these ecclesiastics, whose morals and doctrines have been generally approved, we deemed it proper to second the wishes of this great sovereign and great benefactor of ours. Wherefore, by our letter in the form of a brief, dated the 7th of March, 1801, we granted to Francis Caron and his companions, resident in Russia or proceeding from other countries, the faculty of constituting themselves into a body or congregation styled the Company of Jesus, for which purpose we appointed Francis Caron general of the said congregation, and we authorized him again to take up and follow the rule of St. Ignatius de Loyola, in order that his order might again freely occupy themselves in instructing the young in the principles of religion and in good literature, in directing seminaries and colleges, and by confessing, proclaiming the word of God, and administering the sacraments. By the same brief we received the congregation of the Company of Jesus under our protection and into our immediate service, to which effect we abrogated all apostolic constitutions, statutes, uses, privileges, and indulgences hitherto granted and confirmed of a contrary tenor to those concessions, and especially the apostolic letters of Pope Clement XIV. Shortly after ordaining the restoration of the Jesuits in Russia, we granted a like favor to the kingdom of Sicily in deference to the repeated instances of our dear son in Jesus Christ, King Ferdinand, who was convinced that, in these deplorable times, the Jesuits were the most suitable masters to train the young in Christian piety and in the fear of God. We received every day pressing supplications from our venerable brethren, the bishops and archbishops, for the reestablishment of the Company of Jesus, especially since it has been known what abundant fruits their labors have produced in the above-mentioned countries. We should think ourselves guilty of a great sin before God if we were to slight the succors that were afforded us by his especial providence. Determined by so many in such important considerations, we mean now to realize that which we would fain have done at the commencement of our pontificate. After imploring with fervent prayers the divine assistance and listening to the counsels of many of our venerable brethren, the cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, we have decreed that our certain knowledge, in virtue of the plenitude of our apostolic power, and with a view to its perpetual validity, that all the concessions and faculties, heretofore by us granted solely to the Russian Empire and to the kingdom of the two Sicilies, shall be henceforth extended to our ecclesiastical states and to all states whatsoever. We ordain that the present letters shall be inviolably observed according to their present form and tenor, henceforth and forever, that they shall produce their full and entire effect, that they shall not be subjected to any judgment or revision from any judge with whatever power he may be invested, and we declare void and of none effect every opposition that may be offered to the present provisions through malice or through ignorance, and this in spite of the apostolic constitutions and ordinances, and of the letter in the form of a brief of Clement XIV, issued on the 11th of July, 1773, which we abrogate insofar as it is opposed to the present constitution. Wherefore, let no one venture to contravene or to oppose with audacious rashness any of the provisions of this our ordinance, or if anyone do so, let him know that he incurs the indignation of Almighty God and of the holy apostles St. Peter and St. Paul." Unquote. The French Revolution of the last century, and the ideas of liberty which it diffused through the world, were the true causes of the reconciliation between the kings and the Jesuits, who felt it necessary to come to an understanding and forget all their past differences to concert measures for defending themselves against a common enemy. It was but as long as the people counted for nothing that their rulers could afford to wrangle with one another on questions of precedence, the church provoking kings by laying hands on the temporal power, and the kings endeavoring to subject the church to themselves in spiritual concerns as well as in temporal. The example of the Jesuits, who had taken vows of poverty, but who possessed individually and collectively temporal estates of the value of many millions at the time of their suppression by Clement XIV, in this only 200 years after their first foundation, proves in a striking manner how difficult it is to separate spiritualities from temporalities. The continued maintenance of the company, in spite of its dissolution by the Pope, proves, moreover, that it had a life independent of the life of Catholicism and its own interests, views, and policy. While the kings contended with the popes in defense of their prerogatives, which the court of Rome refused to recognize, and in fact could not recognize without abjuring its supremacy, that indispensable condition of its authority and even of its existence, so long the Jesuits were ardent defenders of the papal privileges as being synonymous with their own, and they were persecuted by the kings on this account. But when the nations declared that they belonged neither to the kings nor the popes, but to themselves, when they struggled to vindicate their rights of sovereignty against every preceding sovereignty, divine or human, then the enmities of the popes and the kings disappeared, and with them those of the kings and the Jesuits. The three parties, as soon as their flock began to quit the fold, united themselves into one corps without distinction of sentiments to reclaim these precious animals from the attempt to live on their own account. In this way we have seen the popes making common cause with the heretical and schismatical sovereigns of Prussia, Russia, and England, and owing to them the preservation of their temporal power. We have seen the Jesuits, who were established to propagate the Catholic faith and defend the Church against heretics, defended themselves by heretical and schismatic sovereigns. The former champions of the altar against the throne became champions of both against the people. Hence it was from the latter that their persecutions came when revolution triumphed. The Jesuits fell in France with the monarchy of the 18th century. They left Naples as exiles with the Bourbon king who had re-established them. The Spanish Revolution re-expelled them, and New Granada, the Equator, and Mexico followed the example of the European nations by expelling them, together with the reactionary, monarchical, and oligarchical systems of policy of which they had made themselves the champions. It was in 1820 the Jesuits were expelled from Russia and Poland, and in 1871 the people of Rome rose against them and turned them out of the capital of their church. The remaining religious orders, which had formerly been rivals of the Company of Jesus, have ended in taking it for a model, because, by being persecuted together with it, they have learned that only in an alliance between all the forces of the Church could the means be found of maintaining a struggle with the torrent of modern civilization and the new ideas that accompany it, awaking intellects and unfolding new horizons to them, so as to promise their emancipation from the theocratic domination exercised over them during so many centuries. Hence the political reaction of 1814 re-established the Jesuits by converting them into a tool of the statesman, and all the reactions that have since occurred have followed the same course. The institution has not been reformed, and the Jesuits continue to form an independent body, whose general is subject to the Pope merely in name. In conformity with their old rules, they change their habit according to circumstances. They occupy all kinds of public functions, and where they cannot be confessors of kings, are confessors of their confessors. Their history is full of examples of the fury with which they have been persecuted, and the futility of persecutions, which have never been more persistently frustrated than by the company of the Freemasons in the Company of Jesus. At the close of 1863, the Jesuits, according to the documents they have themselves published, numbered 7,259 members and 7,728 in the year 1864. But we do not know whether these figures included the novices. In the territory which recently remained papal, there were 475 Jesuits, of whom 383 resided in Rome, and the remainder in the colleges depending on the provinces of Viterbo, Camarsa, Velletri, and Fraucincoed. The Company of Jesus is now divided into 21 provinces, of which there are 2 in Spain, 4 in France, 5 in Germany and Holland, 5 in Italy, 1 in Mexico, 2 in England and Ireland, and 2 in the United States of America. In 1540, when the company was founded, there were but 9 Jesuits. In 1568, or 128 years after their foundation, they were divided into 18 provinces and 103 houses containing 3,500 members. In 1762, when their famous persecution by the kings and popes commenced, the company numbered 5 assistancies, 39 provinces, 24 houses of professed brethren, 669 colleges, 61 houses of novices, 176 seminaries, 335 residences, and 223 missions. In all, 1,506 establishments, occupied by 22,787 Jesuits, of whom 11,010 were professed brethren. The property confiscated from the Jesuits in this period, in the various countries they had visited in Europe and America, exceeded in value 12 millions sterling of that period, which would be worth about 5 times as much now. How much have they now? Only their general can tell. As for their seminaries, colleges, and schools of all kinds, we are equally in the dark, though we are disposed to think that the Jesuits must have a great number, considering how much protection is extended to them by the governments which are most inclined to oppression and despotism, and therefore most desirous of seeing young people indoctrinated with the principle of blind obedience, which is the very foundation of the existence of the company and all its teaching. But what is good for those who wish to control the people cannot be so for the people themselves. If Jesuitical education is adapted to dispose the mind for slavery, it cannot be adapted to dispose them for liberty, independence, dignity, patriotism, and the love of justice, which are inseparable things in correlative terms of one principle. Since, for the slave who abdicates his will and judgment to submit to the will and judgment of another, there cannot exist a notion or a sentiment of patriotism, dignity, justice, or independence. Neither, then, by their principles, their tendencies, their doctrines, nor their institutions, are the Jesuits qualified to prepare the young for the fulfillment of their duties or the exercise of their rights as citizens of a free state. There are many who extol and recommend the Jesuits as teachers, not on account of the ideas which they inculcate, but of their method of instruction, which is said to be one of the best possible for making the people take in whatever he has to learn. If this be the truth, so much the worse. The boasted discipline is only a good weapon handled in a bad cause. Nevertheless, the experience of 3 centuries protests against the teaching of the Jesuits from whatever quarter it is regarded. It is nearly a century since they were expelled from Spain, and the majority of the youth in that country who have received a good education have not owed it to Jesuitical method. Yet in what respect is any inferiority evinced by the generations that have arisen in Spain between Charles III and the present day, as compared with those that were educated by the Jesuits between the middle of the 16th century and 1770? The inferiority of these last is indisputable. History shows us that the regeneration of Spain was winged and stimulated by the expulsion of the Jesuits, and at its very epoch. The like may be said of France, while England, which has constantly refused to entertain them or entrust to them the education of her children, and the North American Republic, in which they have never had the smallest influence, are the nations that have marched at the head of civilization and left the rest a century behind them, whereas Russia, Poland, Italy, Paraguay, the Philippine Islands, and the countries in general in which the influence of the Jesuits and the number of their disciples have been the greatest, have remained in the rear, subjected to a yoke either native or foreign, plunged in superstition and fanaticism, and destitute of that great and noble human sentiment of dignity which prompts men to rebel against the oppression to which they see other men submitting. It must not be thought, for all this, that we approve the persecutions which have been inflicted on the Jesuits, much less the violent and arbitrary manner in which they were turned out of Spain by Charles III. Although the Company of Jesus may well be, in any properly administered state, proscribed and condemned by the laws as hostile to the principles of society and of human nature, yet the individuals who compose it ought not on this ground to be persecuted. Only if the society is dissolved and the members released from the passive obedience which they owe their general, and from other obligations not less monstrous, they are not hereby persecuted, but rather relieved from a real persecution, as from the abdication and suppression of the most noble attributes of a human being. On these grounds, while we condemn the persecutions and outrages to which the Jesuits have been subjected, we applaud the governments that have suppressed the company, and we find perfectly well justified the sense of repugnance which its members have everywhere inspired.